Throughout the First World War, tens of millions of servicemen fought across battlefields around the globe. Around 9 million of them never came home. For many families, the war at least left behind a place to mourn, a grave, a name carved into stone, a cemetery somewhere in France or Belgium. But for countless others, the war ended differently. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, more than 1 million families still had no idea what had happened to their sons, brothers, or husbands. No body, no grave, no certainty, only a single word on a telegram. Missing. This is the story of one of those men, and the decades-long search to find him. John Kipling was just 17 years old when Britain entered the war in 1914. He was the only son of Rudyard Kipling, the world-famous author of The Jungle Book, and one of the most influential literary voices of the British Empire. John grew up in privilege at Bateman's, the Kipling family home in the Sussex countryside, surrounded by politicians, writers, and artists. But like so many young men of his generation, John was swept up in the patriotic atmosphere of the war's opening months. Today, many know him as Jack, largely because of his father's famous poem and the film My Boy Jack starring Daniel Radcliffe. In reality, however, he was always known simply as John. And John desperately wanted to serve. There was just one problem: his eyesight was terrible. He was so severely short-sighted that both the Army and the Navy initially rejected him as medically unfit for service. But his father refused to accept that decision. Rudyard Kipling used his considerable influence and personal connections to push for another opportunity, and eventually John secured a commission with the prestigious Irish Guards. He was underage and technically unfit for frontline duty, but he got his uniform anyway. By the time John completed his training in mid-1915, the war had already changed completely. The dream of a fast-moving campaign had vanished. In its place stretched an enormous trench system, running from the North Sea all the way to Switzerland. The Germans had dug themselves deep into the earth. Their defensive positions were no longer simple trenches, but elaborate fortified systems protected by machine guns, dugouts, and thick belts of barbed wire. Any attack now meant crossing open ground under artillery and machine gun fire. Despite this, the Allies prepared another major offensive in the autumn of 1915. The French would attack in Champagne. The British would strike around Loos, a flat industrial region in northern France. That was where John Kipling was sent. At first glance, the battlefield around Loos looked strangely ordinary. Flat fields, mining villages, slag heaps, and industrial buildings dominated the landscape. But that same terrain made every attack brutally dangerous. Even today, the huge slag heaps known as the Double Crasier dominate the skyline. They already existed in 1915, though smaller than they are now. Nearby stood the village of Loos itself, several mining complexes, and an industrial area known as Puits 14 bis close to the German lines. Between these landmarks ran trenches, shattered roads, communication lines, and cratered fields. To navigate this chaos, armies relied on detailed trench maps. The battlefield was divided into massive grid squares, each broken down again into smaller sectors. With these coordinates, locations could be pinpointed with remarkable accuracy. For the men fighting there, those maps could mean the difference between life and death. Because on a battlefield covered in smoke, mud, and shell craters, it was frighteningly easy to lose all sense of direction. On the morning of September 25, 1915, the Battle of Loos began. Before dawn, John and thousands of other soldiers were awakened by the thunder of British artillery. Heavy guns hammered the German lines for hours. Then the British unleashed a new weapon on a massive scale: chlorine gas. Greenish clouds drifted slowly toward the German trenches. At least, that was the plan. In some sectors, the wind shifted unexpectedly and blew the gas back into the British lines instead. Hundreds of British soldiers were injured or suffocated before the attack had even begun. Still, the infantry advanced. In the south, British troops initially made genuine progress. The London Irish famously kicked a football across no man's land before storming the German trenches. By the end of the fighting, the village of Loos itself had fallen into British hands. But further north, the situation was very different. There, attacking troops walked straight into devastating machine gun fire. Entire waves of men collapsed before ever reaching the German positions. The Hohenzollern redoubt became one of the deadliest points on the battlefield. By the end of the first day, thousands of dead and wounded men lay scattered across the fields around Loos, and the battle was still far from over. That night, John managed to write home one last time. The letter sounded surprisingly calm. He wrote about the endless marching, the pouring rain, and the belief that this offensive might finally break the deadlock and end the war. The guns, he told his father, had been firing without pause all day long. He understood that the coming hours could change everything. It would be his final letter home. September 26th brought renewed attacks. Fresh divisions were thrown into the battle, including many of the so-called Kitchener armies, volunteer formations filled with young men who had never seen combat before. The results were catastrophic. Inexperienced soldiers advanced across open ground directly into concentrated machine gun fire. Thousands were killed within hours. Some German troops later referred to part of the battlefield simply as the field of corpses. Yet Allied commanders still believed a breakthrough might be possible, especially in the southern sector where some progress had been made. It was there that the Irish Guards would now be committed. On September 27th, John and his battalion received their orders. They were to attack diagonally across open fields toward Chalk Pit Wood, a nearby quarry, and the industrial buildings at Puit's 14 bis. To get there, they would have to cross more than 600 yards of completely exposed ground. No one knew exactly how strong the German defenses still were. At around 4 p.m., the attack began. Under cover of renewed artillery fire, the Irish Guards climbed from their positions and advanced forward across the fields. At first, things appeared to go according to plan. The battalion moved steadily towards the Chalk Pit area and actually managed to reach parts of the objective. Then the machine guns opened fire. Hidden German positions suddenly erupted from the front and flanks at the same time. Within moments, hundreds of men were hit. The formation collapsed into chaos. Small groups pushed forward under the leadership of surviving officers, while others desperately searched for cover among shell holes and shattered trees. But the fire was overwhelming. Eventually, the survivors were forced to retreat. By the time the last men stumbled back to the British lines, the Irish Guards had suffered more than 300 casualties. 18-year-old John Kipling was missing. 4 days later, the news reached his family. A telegram informed his mother, Carrie, that her son was missing in action. According to those present, Rudyard Kipling responded by letting out a curse like a dying man. What followed was one of the cruelest experiences of the war. Not knowing. Families across Europe endured the same torment. Every morning they waited for the postman, hoping for news, fearing confirmation. The Kiplings, however, possessed influence few others could match. They wrote letters to officers, diplomats, and politicians. They sent telegrams across Europe and even arranged for leaflets to be dropped behind German lines in the hope that someone might know what had happened to John. But no definitive answer ever came. Only when wounded soldiers returned home did fragments of information begin to emerge. Some men claimed to have seen John wounded during the attack. Others believed he had been captured alive. His company commander later wrote that John had last been seen near Puit's 14. One soldier recalled seeing him limping before he disappeared. Another claimed someone had tried to help him. Other accounts were even more disturbing. One guardsman later described John suffering a terrible wound to the face. A sergeant claimed he had seen him shot while firing his revolver toward the German positions, but none of the stories could ever be fully confirmed. The war finally ended in November 1918. Prisoners of war returned home. Families found closure. But John Kipling was not among those who came back. Still, his parents never completely abandoned hope. Meanwhile, search teams began combing the old battlefields, recovering bodies from the trenches and shell craters of the Western Front. On September 23, 1919, members of the 18th Labour Company discovered the remains of an unknown Irish Guards officer on the Loos battlefield. At first, the location appeared not to match where John had last been seen. But decades later, historians revisited the case. They compared trench maps, war diaries, burial reports, and unit records. Eventually, they noticed something extraordinary: a likely error in the original battlefield coordinates. Suddenly, the discovery site was no longer miles away. It was exactly where John Kipling had last been reported alive. Further investigation revealed that only a handful of missing Irish Guards officers could possibly fit the evidence. 2 were eventually ruled out. One had died elsewhere after capture. Another had already been buried in a known location. In the end, only one name remained: John Kipling. In 1992, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission officially reviewed the evidence and accepted the conclusion. 77 years after his death, the unknown officer finally received his name. Today, John Kipling is officially recognized as the soldier buried in Plot 7, Row D, Grave 2 at St. Mary's Advanced Dressing Station Cemetery in France. But his parents never learned that truth. Both died in the 1930s without ever knowing for certain where their son lay buried. And yet one remarkable thought remains. In 1924, Rudyard Kipling personally visited this cemetery. He walked among the white headstones, past rows of named and unnamed dead. Perhaps on that day, he paused at this very grave. Perhaps he stood before his son's resting place without ever realizing it.